I'm Jory Desjardins of the atCompany. For those of you who don't know the atCompany, we're a group of technologists and developers, storytellers, and we've built our careers on the internet. And we're building a better internet and better internet experiences through technology that empowers us to own and control our own data. So today we're going to be focusing on data privacy, but also what are we doing about data privacy? The theme for this month is, for those of you who are in the US, you know we just had a US election, but all around the world there's a lot of legislation and policy that is being enacted around controlling our data. And because of that, we're wondering, what is being done for users and for the people who are using the internet, and what still needs to happen today? We were galvanized at the atCompany by the recent docudrama, The Social Dilemma. We thought that it really brought questions around our data into light, but we also thought that The Social Dilemma created a lot of new questions for us. What do we do now? What are we doing now? And what can we, as the users of the internet, as people who are using the internet, what can we do? And what do we have at our disposal now to protect our data and to have better internet experiences? So the panel that we have here today have been thinking a lot about this question. They are technologists, they're policy experts, they're lawyers, and they're here to share more about what they're working on around this question. So before we dig in, I just want to make sure we have some housekeeping notes here. Samantha Latimer, if you can just give us a quick hello. Samantha's with the atCompany, and she will be taking in questions. We'll have about 20 to 30 minutes of questions of Q&A amongst the panelists, and then we're going to be capturing questions throughout, and then we will open it up. So Samantha Latimer is her name. You can ping her directly, or you can leave your question in the chat and she will capture it there so we can ask it later.
Hi, everyone. That's me.
Great, thanks. All right, so without further ado, I'd love to have the panelists introduce themselves and share a bit about their perspective and what they're working on around this issue, starting with Enoch Liang of the Data Dividend Project.
Hi, Jory, Samantha, and everybody at the atCompany. Thank you for hosting this talk. My name is Enoch Liang. I'm the CEO of the Data Dividend Project, DDP short. DDP's goal is to help people take back control of their data, and if they choose to share it, to be able to share in the revenue and profits that are generated on the backs of their data. We were founded in June of this year. We were inspired by a lot of the ideas that Andrew Yang, who was running for president as a Democrat, gave on the trail and on the debate stages. And between June and today, we've signed up tens of thousands of people who want to designate DDP to act as their authorized agent under the California Consumer Privacy Act in order to collectively bargain and negotiate with technology companies who are using and selling their data to make billions of dollars.
Thank you. Dr. King.
Hi, good morning. I'm Jen King. I am presently the Director of Consumer Privacy at the Center for Internet and Society at Stanford Law School. In that role, I really focus on all things related to consumer privacy, information privacy. And so a lot of my work is following the policy developments in this area, such as the 2 new California laws that we have, watching kind of international trends in privacy, and also doing some hands-on research and trying to better understand, how do we improve data privacy for people and their experiences online? Thanks.
Great, thank you. And Kevin Nichols.
Hi all, I'm Kevin. I'm one of the founders of the atCompany. We're basically, we believe that technology has created quite a mess over 30 years or so. And but we are also optimistic enough to believe that technology can be part of the solution. So we're trying to create solutions for allowing people to control their data and themselves, not just data, but also access to their space, their time, and essentially create an advocacy for people in order to express their desires. And with Jen and Enid's help, we'll get corporations to be either enticed or forced to honor the wishes of consumers and real people. I mean, we're very focused on people first, and we think that's just been missing from the internet from the beginning. And so we're very excited to do it in surprisingly simple ways that can be applied to lots of different use cases. So it's so far so good in terms of how we've made progress. We're very excited about it.
Fantastic, thanks. All right, well, let's start with some questions. Enid, I'd like to start with you. So where I'm based here in California, we think a lot about data and privacy, and we even had legislation, Prop 24, which passed here in California, which was an extension of CCPA. And yet, just in basic conversation with people that are nearby and that were voting in that election, there's still so much confusion around what was Prop 24, why was it different from CCPA, and what are the differences in how people are viewing data and privacy? For example, there's another organization, the Electronic Frontier Foundation, that didn't support the proposition. And yet I would think that we are all pretty aligned with EFF around data and privacy. So what are some of the nuances here in how we're viewing privacy and data?
Jory, I think in order to answer that question, I have to give a little bit of background about the CCPA and what Prop 24 added to the CCPA. Is that okay?
Yes, please.
Okay. So the California Consumer Privacy Act started off as a ballot initiative, a referendum in the state of California. And the legislature ended up passing the CCPA, and the referendum was withdrawn. The CCPA gave California consumers a number of rights that were in alignment mostly with the GDPR, which was the European law. And those rights included things like the right to know what personal information is collected and held by the tech companies, the right to delete, the right to demand deletion of your personal information, the right to opt out of the sale of your personal information, and the right to non-discrimination if you opt out of the sale of your personal information. The fifth right is the right to designate an authorized agent to exercise your rights. And that fifth right, the right to designate an authorized agent, is what led to the rise of DDP, because individually, if consumers are negotiating against tech companies, number one, you're completely outgunned and outmanned. Number two, there's no way that a single individual can go read those 50-page licenses and terms and conditions, right? And number three, if everybody is negotiating individually, then it's a race to the bottom. So DDP's idea was to take the authorized agent provisions of the CCPA and use collective bargaining to enhance the power of the consumers. Okay, so the CCPA passed in 2018 and went into effect in January 2020, which means that big tech and lobbyists had all of 2019 to try to kill it. So there were, I think, somewhere between 7 and 12 bills introduced in the California legislature in 2019 that were trying to weaken and completely water down the California Consumer Privacy Act. So when the person behind putting the CCPA onto the ballot in the first place saw what was happening in the legislature, his name's Alastair McTaggart, he's out of San Francisco, he said, okay, this is crazy. I need to put Prop 24 onto the ballot. And the main motivating reason to put Prop 24 on the ballot was if Prop 24 passed, it had a provision in there that said you can amend, the legislature can amend the Prop 24, but only one way. You can only amend it up to protect and respect consumer privacy more. You cannot amend it down to take away protections for consumer privacy. So essentially, Prop 24 as a ballot initiative, which by the way did pass 56% to 44% on November 3rd. The main thrust of Prop 24 was legislature, we are going to protect the consumer privacy laws in California from big tech and lobbyists, because now you are permitted to amend it, but you can only amend it one way, which is to protect consumer privacy more, not loosen the protections on consumer privacy that were conferred by the CCPA. Now, there are a number of other things that Prop 24 did in addition to that protection. I think that the biggest two, I mean, there's probably like 19 or 20 different things that Prop 24 added to the CCPA, but the biggest two, besides making consumer privacy the floor, the biggest two are it established a California Privacy Protection Agency to regulate technology companies in California and enforce the provisions of the CCPA and Prop 24. And it gave that Privacy Protection Agency a $10 million annual budget, which allows California to hire, I believe, something like 40 to 50 privacy regulators, which it would be as many as the entire FTC has in its privacy division to regulate the whole country. And then I think a second big thing that Prop 24 did is it established a new category of sensitive personal information. So above and beyond your personal information, there's now a category of sensitive personal information, which includes things like your social security number, your ethnicity, your religion, your union membership, your biometric or health information, your gender, your sexual preference, et cetera. And it establishes additional protections for sensitive personal information. And then one more thing is Prop 24 also tripled the fines for violations of children's privacy. So that's kind of a very high level overview of the CCPA and what Prop 24 did to protect the rights that the CCPA gave you. So I'll stop there and see if you have any follow-up questions, Tori.
Yeah, I wonder, is CCPA a harbinger of what we can expect to see on the national level?
I think that's hard to predict, right? Because we have a new administration coming in that's Democratic. You have the House in control of the Democrats, but the Senate is still very much up in the air. So it's hard to predict what's going to happen at the federal level. I will say that in 2019, there were a lot of federal bills introduced, and ultimately it broke down to the Republicans wanted full federal preemption and no private right of action for enforcement, whereas the Democrats wanted less, in other words, not complete federal preemption. They wanted the federal law to be the floor, but states could go further, and they wanted some type of private right of action for enforcement. But that was 2019, and as we all know, 2020, everything went haywire. All of the energy was focused on COVID. And in September of 2020, there were some more hearings on data privacy. A lot of that was overshadowed by the election. So it's hard to predict what's going to happen in 2021 with respect to a federal data privacy bill. But I do believe that a new bill has been introduced by the Republicans. And also the state of Washington recently introduced the Washington Privacy Act of 2021. And the state of New York has introduced a number of data privacy bills as well as a number of data dividend bills.
Okay, that's helpful in just setting the tone for where we are right now from a legislative perspective. Jennifer, so you had shared that with me earlier, that data and the data privacy issues, it's a collective action problem. What in your view will it take to rebuild the internet?
Well, Dory.
An easy question.
Glad I didn't get that question.
I know.
Yeah.
I have all the answers. No, I wish I did. I think the challenge is that there's not a single path forward. And I would say, one of the things that I'd like to point out is that all of us here, I think, are really interested in the same issues, and we may just have differences on how to kind of build that path forward, but we're all trying to get to the same place, which is, the sense that data is totally out of our control, that we have these things that are tied to us, and yet we don't seem to be able to do anything about it, right? So these first kind of steps forward, whether we look at the GDPR in Europe or we're looking at CCPA and CPRA here in California, have really been focused on the individual, like giving us individual rights, trying to establish individual control. And I do think that's both good and necessary. But I think one of the things we need to think about is that this problem is just broader than all of us individually can necessarily tackle. And we do need to think of other solutions that allow us to kind of collectively wage power or gain control over data. And so that can look a lot of different ways. You can look at new forms of data governance, which I won't go deeply into because it could be a very wonky topic. But new ways of basically organizing our data, licensing it potentially, having ways that basically take some of the pressure off of individuals to manage this all. And also their different contexts too. So a lot of what we often end up talking about is the individual consumer. And that's where the internet privacy debate has been, let's say the previous 10 years, but we're really in a shift right now where data has become so pervasive and used in so many contexts that it's no longer just about like us and our shopping. I feel like a lot of the debates in the previous 10 years were really focused on our online purchasing habits and advertising, and that equation is changing. When we go into public spaces now, we can't presume that we are anonymous, for example. You have to presume that people are potentially trying to collect data about you, whether it's the police, whether it's municipalities, whether it's private actors, and that data, can really vary. It's not just about what I'm buying online or what ads I might be shown. One of the areas I think that we've seen this come up very poignantly is with facial recognition. So facial recognition in public spaces, so that's a type of data use that I think kind of cries out for a collective action solution. Some cities in the US their solution has been simply to ban it. They're not going to allow either the police use or municipal use of facial recognition technology, full stop. That's it. We think that's something in society that we don't want to allow. That's the type of, I think that's a good example of a problem where individually, like we probably can't do much as single individuals about pushing back on widespread surveillance. And so you would need more of a collective solution. And don't get distracted by the word collective. I'm not talking about socialism. I don't want people to take that necessarily in that way, but just more the fact that we need to think around these data problems and try to identify the areas that we think from a society-wide perspective, we either want to put things off limits or put restrictions on things. And it can't all just be about me having to make 6 trillion different decisions about all these different actors in this wide space and how to manage that.
So Kevin, what is tech's responsibility in all of this? Right? It seems that technology, there's policy and then technology catches up as much as it needs to. But ultimately, it would seem that there's more that we can be doing.
I think the best thing the way that I always think about technology and this applied to this kind of problem is how do you create a really simple system that with a feedback mechanism that encourages one type of behavior versus another. And so we have examples, and Social Dilemma talks a lot about examples of I'm going to create a feedback mechanism for people to stay longer on Facebook so I can sell more ads and that kind of stuff. In their view, they're probably like, I'm just going to create a really cool app that people like to stay on for a long time and I make more money too. And so there probably is somewhat of a maybe naive but innocent starting of that. But at the same time, I think the way that I tend to think about it is how do we encourage especially for online behavior, but not just online, but how do I encourage behavior that engenders a network of trust and that where interactions are based on trust? And so what we tried to engineer with the app protocol is a way of doing that so that you can actually have things that the more it's used, then the higher the level of trust goes up and the higher the quality of interactions goes up, and hopefully things become more polite. I mean, we have this stealing from a movie, this thing called ectogamut, which is not without permission. So we've really tried to make that as easy as possible. And Jen said the way to get if this becomes a an additional task or a big effort that you have to do to manage things, people will not do it. It can't be hard. This has to be it has to yield better user experiences than what they had before. And then people say, I get this better user experience, and it's my privacy is dealt with automatically. Yay! That's the goal. So the goal is not to make things more tedious, more problematic, but actually to make them more fun and at the same time much more safe and pleasurable, because people will then probably share maybe even more than before. But at least if they know and they can trust what is being done with the data that they're sharing, or their time or space. I mean, it's not just data again, but if they trust that, then then the quality of interaction goes up. But we do want to see people be polite to each other on the internet. That would be a nice thing.
That would be a nice thing.
That would be a nice
thing. In terms of tech's responsibility, it seems that, we went after CCPA, then tech catches up, and then, so perhaps anticipating some of these things in advance would be helpful. But you've even said to us, as we were talking about the enterprise, that the enterprise actually can't, by design right now, be compliant with privacy. Can you talk a bit about that right now? What is the issue?
Oh, there's so many issues. That's a great question. So I don't want to get too technical on it, but so basically, if you the first thing I would say is that when CCPA came out, everybody that I know in the tech world was like, how the hell do I get around this? I mean, what are my ways of working around this? Because I don't, I guess I have to comply as much as I have to comply, and that's it. So they're looking at ways to get around. And so that was, as opposed to embracing it and saying, actually, I can create something better because of it, which is what they should be thinking. And innovators do think that way. So, so that would be the first thing. Within the enterprise context, most data governance, data security, access control models are all very high level constructs in the data. And there's always, if you get down to the database itself, there's a sysadmin with the keys to get into the database, and they get access to everything. So security at the enterprise level today is an illusion of security. There really isn't security at the enterprise, especially as it pertains to protecting people's data, because somebody in the enterprise can get access to everybody's data, which means that somebody from the outside, if they get those keys, gets access to everybody's data in the enterprise. And those are the breaches we have billions of people's data being let loose in the wild because somebody got into an enterprise system. So so that's one of the reasons that we've tried to push it way down the stack, in not application level, but down at the protocol level, and with very sophisticated encryption around that, in order to make sure that even if they got into the database, they can't do anything with it because it's an encrypted blob of stuff that they don't have the hold the keys. The actual owner of the data holds the keys. So that's probably more technical than you wanted, but there you go.
But it explains why companies, even those that say that they are compliant, really technically can't be compliant right now.
I really don't. I don't think you can do this by inspection. This can't be done by having policies and procedures and manuals of stuff that you're supposed to follow. Because I mean, bad actors don't follow those manuals. So you've got to be really deal with it at a fundamental level and do it properly.
So Jennifer, I love some of the phrasing that you use to describe issues around privacy. And we make privacy more like a cupcake.
I don't know. I keep thinking bran muffin with icing.
Yes.
So, I mean, I think the fundamental challenge is that so much of what happens with our data today and our lives online is not only something we don't control, but we're not aware of. And one of the things we've seen consistently in the research community on privacy is when you start showing people essentially what is happening, that targeted ads, are based on data that have been collected from, let's say, your mobile phone, that without you necessarily understanding that that's happening, that most people find those practices to be pretty offensive. Like they don't want them to be happening. And so I think, step one is realizing that you can't control something that you don't know about, right? So, the longer we continue to allow data to be collected about us with absolutely no recognition, no opt-in, no voice, then there's very little we can do. So that's step one, I think, is, trying to plug those holes, essentially. So, then assuming that you can actually have, a baseline of rights and a baseline of understanding what data is being collected about you, then I think we can start having the conversations of like how to make this more productive, more fulfilling, more interesting. Because right now it's, I get asked by journalists constantly, I'm writing that article, trying to give people, the 5 easy steps to protect their online privacy. And I always just want to like rip my hair out because I'm like, look, there's only so much you can do today. There just isn't that much. I mean, there's some, but for now, our lives online are generally not optional. Yes, you could argue that the time you spend on a service like Facebook is totally optional. That may be true. I know lots of contexts where people are more or less required to be on Facebook. In fact, on college campuses, there are often, like residence halls where the entire residence hall manages itself on Facebook. And so even if you don't want to be on Facebook, you're kind of forced to be so. But because we are forced to live online in so many contexts, the ways in which you can even begin to manage your data have to be simplified. And so, I think it's not so much about making it pleasurable, but making it into something that's even first achievable, actionable, because really today, there's, you can do a handful of things, but, short of becoming an electronic hermit, really pulling back, deciding to not use a smartphone, I can go on and on. There's a lot of different things I think that most of us would consider fairly extreme steps you'd have to take that we don't want to have to take. There's a great book on this topic by Julia Angwin, and I can't remember the name of it right now, of course, but she's now the editor-in-chief of a site called The Markup, and she spent a year trying to live her life kind of totally unsurveilled, not necessarily off the grid, but unsurveilled, and it was just almost impossible. So just to highlight that if we can first get to the point where you actually do have actionable control and you have real options, today, again, we're so forced into these take it or leave it relationships where we have no bargaining power. We have no way to alter the terms of the relationship. It's, accept these terms and move on and don't bother to look and see what's going on. You won't understand it anyway because it's not written in a way that explains things to you. So many of these parts of the equation are beyond our control and really set up to not make this easy for us, that it would take kind of a big paradigm shift, I think, on a lot of different levels before we get to the point where you actually feel like you can truly accomplish something. And I think when that's really an option, when you can actually say, hey, I have a choice here. I don't want to give all this data to this company, or I actually do want to, and I have a good feeling that it's not actually going to be exploited in a way that I don't like, then it becomes more in cupcake than bran muffin. But even so, I would say, given how many relationships we have, what we need are solutions that help us manage our privacy across different contexts and different relationships. Because even if we improve all the things I've talked about, if you actually sat down and tried to, you might be able to do this. I have a password manager, so I'm sure I could list out exactly how many accounts I have online, and I'm going to guess it's probably like over 300 at this point, different passwords, different logins. Just imagining those relationships and trying to actively manage every one. Like we can't. That's, I think, what is the number of the Dunbar's number? Like we can only actively know 100 plus people as actual human beings in the world. Like how can we also have that same relationship with 500 different companies? So, so part of this is looking for solutions that make these things easier for us, because cognitively we can't handle it. We can't handle all these relationships. It's just too much.
I think that's a very good segue for both Enoch and for Kevin. But Enoch, when I think about the Data Dividend project, I think of that as about the paradigm shift. It's about changing the narrative. If we can't control what's happening to our data at this moment, we should at least be aware of it, and we can even be compensated for the use of it. Can you speak a little bit more about the philosophy behind it? And also, I would say that DDP it takes a very pragmatic approach to data and privacy. So just here, I would love to hear a little bit more about how you view the narrative. What is the narrative that you're trying to make public?
Well, Jory, before I answer that, do you mind if I just zoom out a bit and build on some themes that Dr. King and Kevin were talking about?
Sure.
The way that we view the situation right now and the solutions moving forward at a very, very high level are kind of how you would view four legs of a chair. The way that we think that the paradigm shift that Dr. King mentioned is going to come about is, leg one, it has to be consumer awareness of the problem. And, the social dilemma, that docudrama, I think is really building on awareness, at least in America, of what happened with their data in Cambridge Analytica and what's happening now with retargeting and micro-targeting. So I think that you're starting to see that first leg of the chair starting to happen in terms of awareness in the United States. The second leg of the chair is exactly what Kevin is talking about, is coming up with technological solutions that are easy to use, easy to manage, that are privacy by design, and that, as Dr. King mentioned, there's no way you can manage 300 relationships. And so you have to have an easy technological solution that doesn't really change your life that much, but that you can trust and know that your data is being protected. So that's the second leg of the chair. I think the third leg of the chair is really regulation and policy. And Jory, I might have to disagree with you here a little bit. You were saying that tech would follow the law. I actually think it's the reverse. I think that tech gets free reign for 10 or 15 years until some scandals happen, and then people in Congress start waking up and start trying to put in regulations, but it's too little too late, right? The Pandora's box has already been opened for like 15 years before Congress even realized anything. And then, so that's the third leg of the chair. And then I think the fourth leg of the chair is really enforcing those regulations. And because, law and regulations are no good on the books if there isn't any enforcement. So if you view those four legs of the chair, where does DDP fall? Well, I think DDP falls, number one, in education and consumer awareness, and trying to help educate consumers as to what's happening to their data and how much money technology companies are making off of it and what rights they do have, and how those individual rights are much more effective if they're bundled into collective rights and collective action is taken by so-called data unions or data collectives, whatever you want to call it, data cooperatives. The European Union actually just released the Data Governance Act, and without getting too wonky, just at a very high level, the European Union Data Governance Act actually actually has entire articles for regulating data intermediaries, which are another word for data co-ops or data unions. So I think the EU is starting to realize this as well. So I think DDP falls squarely into that first leg of the chair in terms of consumer awareness and building consumer awareness. And then I think DDP also falls into that fourth leg of the chair, which is enforcement of the laws and the regulations that are now on the books. And one example of that is, helping people realize that their data is worth something and actually making claims to it, because companies like Yahoo, like Facebook, like Google are constantly subject to data breaches, as Kevin mentioned, because those keys in the system are going to be held in the hands of the system administrator, and if they're hacked, then they have access to all of the records. Well, the law does provide some redress for us. It's just that none of us ever claim it, and that's in the form of class actions and class action settlements. If you had a Yahoo account, the settlement there was 125 million plus. If you're a resident of Illinois and had a Facebook account, the settlement there was $650 million. How many of us actually made claims to that, right? The average claims rate for a class action settlement is something in the range of 3 to 5%. So DDP has been trying to help consumers navigate that claims process and help you realize that there is money out there, and that you should be making claims to it, because the technology companies are settling these class actions, and you should go and make your claim to that. I think the Facebook Illinois settlement is going to end up being something like $365 per person. So I'll stop there.
That was like with the tax break that years ago, every family got $300. Facebook could pay that out. That's pretty remarkable. We actually have some questions here, and I think maybe we can start addressing some of the questions. Let me call out Yoel. I know that we were going to ask on behalf, but I thought that it would be a good idea because you've been wanting to ask for a while now. If you just went right ahead.
Sure. Hi, my name is Yoel Ferdman. I'm a data activist and data scientist from California, currently relocating to Hawaii during the pandemic. I appreciate all of you taking time to do this. I'm a huge fan of DDP, huge fan of what Andrew Yang has done. So very cool to be here with you, Enoch, and Kevin and Jen. I just wanted to ask you guys a question. I'm not sure who to direct it to, maybe Enoch. But about that one of those legs that you were describing that Kevin was also talking about, which is creating new products and new platforms where the individual owns the data and where it's easy to access your data. So I kind of have a particular take on this revolution that we're all a part of, which is that the only way, like getting us paid is one step, but the only way to really fully make it really fair and make the individual take advantage of the data is to have a platform where we have full access to all of our data. And not only that, we can actually extract value from it. And the only way that you extract value from your data is when it's analyzed, when the machine learning, data science, and AI tools are applied to it. And then when products are built on top of those insights. So what my question is, I guess, is I'm curious to know who's working on that. It's more, I see a lot of people from the legal side of things. I see a lot of people raising awareness, which I think are amazing things that are happening as part of the process. But when it comes to people designing new initiatives that aren't for the benefit of the kind of profit of the company, but for the benefit of the individual, who's doing that, and what are some examples of people or projects that are happening right now?
Yeah, so just to be clear, DDP is a public benefit corporation that's wholly owned by a 501c3 foundation. So we're essentially the subsidiary of a nonprofit. And so I'm not here to endorse any particular company or any particular technology, Yoel. But I would say that in that tech leg of the chair, there are tons of companies that are working on solutions to the situation, just as you described. I mean, obviously, I think the ad company is one. I think Tim Berners-Lee's Solid project just came out with something for enterprises. If you were to just go and look on Product Hunt or any like VC type website, you would see that there are numerous startups that are funded, in some cases very well funded, out of California, out of Israel, out of Europe, out of South America, that are working on solutions to exactly as you described. And some of them are working on the plumbing, some of them are working on the picks and shovels, some of them are working, on the pure monetization aspect. A couple that come to mind are, for example, Kili or Big Token. And I think that the ecosystem is still relatively young. And the question is, which company or companies are going to, quote unquote, win that technology race, and whether they're going to be co-opted by big tech. For example, I know that the CEO of Big Token was just hired by Facebook to go head consumer product privacy at Facebook. So there's always the danger that they're just going to get bought up and incorporated and swallowed by big tech.
Thank you. If I may, can I ask a quick follow-up?
Sure.
Well, I'm curious. how one would prevent these companies from, maybe this is too niche of a question, but how would you prevent these companies from re-entering the same paradigm of being centered around profit? And when you talk about some people working on monetization, how do we make sure that the user and the individual is at the center, and that they maintain ownership, and that these principles that as data activists and privacy experts, as we hold so dear, so tightly, how do we make sure that in a capitalist world where money is the real driving force for these kinds of companies, especially the ones that end up winning the to get people on the platform, how do we actually ensure that they stick to our kind of principles, and that they don't end up just getting people hooked like Instagram does, and then just making people addicted to things that aren't necessarily for their own individual benefit?
I'll give two super short answers, then I'll turn it over to Dr. King or Kevin. Number one is take a look at the Harvard Business Review article, A Blueprint for a Better Digital Society. It was written by Jaron Lanier and Glenn Weil, and it has a number of recommendations in there about how to prevent the co-option that you're talking about, Yoel. Number two is the Data Governance Act essentially imposes something akin to fiduciary duty upon the data intermediaries. And that fiduciary duty means that the companies have to place the interests of their users, their members first, above their own interests. And so those are my two super short answers. And the reason I'm giving them is because my background isn't tech, my background is law and regulation. And so I'm sure Kevin or Dr. King might be able to give a tech answer to how to avoid co-option. But those are the best two short answers I can give you at this point, Yoel.
Yeah, I'll add a couple things quickly. One, to back up what Enoch said, part of it's law and regulation, right? And I think we need to get out of, I hope, thinking about this as another, I guess, arms race to the top, where we see another like dominant platform. I mean, I think that's why several of the players in the space are looking at open standards. So that, for one thing, I mean, I think I would suggest you consider a couple things listening to how you phrase the question. One is that I don't think we're likely to see a one-size-fits-all solution for all of our data. I think you're much more likely to see kind of contextually kind of divided solutions for data. Because if you think about kind of all the different facets of your life, it's probably not likely we're going to want to aggregate everything under one umbrella. I mean, maybe there are cases where we could, but I have a feeling we'll see more kind of slices. The second, and this is something we haven't really picked up on yet today, but I do want to tease it out a little bit, is the sense of, we talk about owning data, which I think can also often be a very good shorthand. It's a concept that people get. I personally think actual ownership of data is a tricky issue from a legal perspective. And one of the biggest concerns that we had from the advocacy community, so groups like EFF with Prop 24, was this question of being able potentially to trade off your data. Because there are real concerns with, I know people want to get value for it, they want to get compensation, but the actual selling of your data implies that you lose control of it. You are selling it off as a piece of property to another entity, and that you will no longer maintain control. And so a lot of these solutions might be focused really on licensing data rather than selling it, because then there's also the question of, what is your data? I mean, really, what are you talking about? Like, if you think about all the data you have at Facebook, let's just pick on Facebook as an example, like, all those different buckets, how much of it is quote unquote yours that you can take with you? How much of it is like service data that's generated about you, and so on? Like, it's not necessarily this very clean cut division between what's yours and what's theirs. It's a complicated question. So those are the two things I would add to this chat.
Kevin.
I think the things, I think a couple things, just again, technically side viewed. So as far as AI goes, and I think, let me just start from the premise of Dr. King, you were mentioning of having all your data in one bucket. Absolutely, that's not even technically feasible, but having control of it is. So if you control the keys to the data and encryption, then you actually, it doesn't matter where it's stored or where it exists. But if you control even the data that's on Facebook, if I hold the keys to it, then I'm controlling the data, and I can say that I own it, or at least I have control over it. So, but if you can imagine that you have a container or a view of all of your data in one place. So imagine that you're Google saying, I want to know everything in the world about Yoel, and I'm going to amass that data on Google servers. Now you move that from Google and you move it to your phone. And now it's on your phone and you control it, it's encrypted by you. But it's all the same data. And so the question is, now I control it. It's all the same data. And if you think of the Venn diagram, so Dr. King, you had 300 entities you're engaging with. If you do a Venn diagram of that data, there's a whole bunch of data that's the same thing over and over and over and over again. And it's apparently your job to go keep them up to date with your data, which is madness. But anyway, so if you actually look at the net corpus of data, it's a lot less than, it's a lot less than the aggregated total that's spread out all over the world that you can't even see. So anyway, so assume that everything's in one place, and you can reason over that data yourself. So the thing about AI takes a huge amount of power to train. It takes almost nothing to run inferences. So running algorithms on your phone is easy. And so you can actually mine your own data like Google and extract the values and insights from your own data. And that's where the application context comes in. But that is totally doable technically. And that's the area that I'm actually the most excited about as we move forward. So once we get the data under your control, then you can figure out what to do with it. And I think it is a lot about the insights and experiences you can derive from it, as well as monetizing it in what we call better services or better treatment by our corporations. So so it doesn't have to be about licensing it to somebody else for them to use. You can say, I'm going to use it for my own purposes, and I will pick the service that gives me the best result from my own data. So if you think about that perspective, and as a paradigm shift, if it's actually moving the cloud, big platform data centers to you, and then you choose how you want to use that, and what results are people engineering to give you that are better or best for you, and it's under your, so the control is the key part of it, I think.
So there are some more questions we have here. NT asks, governments are some of the biggest consumers of personal information, and their track records are spotty. How would one make them more secure? Give you a moment to think about it.
Oh, it's a real concern, right? Because one of the things we're seeing in the current administration is the fact that Homeland Security, or actually, I'm sorry, ICE has been, buying data about, U.S. residents, potentially for immigration enforcement. So completely circumventing any process around, kind of any government requests for data. I mean, if you went to ask the different providers for it directly, you'd have to actually, serve them a subpoena and have to go through legal process. This subverts that. Just go and buy it from a vendor. So this is a real concern, I think, right now around in the privacy advocacy community. And I believe that the only way forward is most likely legislation that prohibits government agencies from buying personal data directly from vendors. Other people may have another perspective on it, but I think that's probably the most targeted way to try to fight that.
Anyone else want to comment?
Yeah, this terrifies me most. The thing that terrifies me and why this is so relevant, especially for things like the DDP and GDPR and CCPA, is, why on earth would a government feel bad for a second about surveilling you and collecting all the data about you when Facebook does it all day long? Well, if they can do it, then I can do it too. And in fact, I can even commercially just go out and buy it. And so why would I not want to go out and buy that data? Because I'm trying to do good. I'm a civil servant. I'm trying to do the right thing mostly. But it's always a slippery slope where, doing good turns into doing really bad really quickly, if not controlled. But I think that if we don't solve this, then I don't see how on earth we're going to get the government to say, if they can do it, then why should I be able to do it too? that's a losing argument in my opinion. I don't think there's enough. There's too many ways around those rules, I think, to have that make sense. So I think we first of all have to solve that problem, that if the whole world is behaving differently, then we can't expect government to do, to do better than that, I think. Enoch, I'm curious what you think. I mean, that's my view on policy, but it's
Yeah, I agree with both Dr. King and you, Kevin. I mean, there is a difference between governmental collection of data and private, right? Because we do have the Fourth Amendment against unreasonable searches and seizures in the United States. But I think that's what Dr. King was saying, is basically you're having warrantless searches and seizures because the government's just going and buying the data from private entities. And so, I agree. It keeps me up at night as well, because, it's not just a surveillance economy for corporate surveillance purposes. You're really moving towards just a surveillance government. And I don't know if you guys have read Yuval Harari's book, 20 Lessons for the 20th Century. Wait, I have it right here. 21 Lessons for the 21st Century. I think one of his chapters talks about how we basically, with the technology that's being created now, you have the most effective general population surveillance and general population persuasion machine that's ever been created in the history of mankind, right? Look at what Hitler did with the radio. Imagine what can be done now with micro-targeting and the types of internet surveillance that we have.
It's a bleak thought. And I would think, though, that it is a matter of policy, and it is a matter of raising awareness in government. And I have to say, you're absolutely right, Enoch, that government does catch up a little later once everything goes, goes haywire. So how can we make them aware sooner before it becomes something we don't want it to be? I think that's the question to answer. I actually I want to pose something from Andy Silvey, who had a really interesting thought here. Cars had seatbelts for decades before people used them, and it was legislation which put in the laws enforcing application of the seatbelt for people's own safety. If there were technology equivalents of the seatbelt for protecting people's online presence, could legislation be put in place enforcing people to use those technologies for their online safety? I think it was a question, but it also was a pretty interesting suggestion.
I think that approach makes more sense if you apply it to companies rather than consumers. Meaning that it's not a problem of trying to get people to wear seatbelts, but initially it was getting the car manufacturers to actually put seatbelts in. After that, it became an issue of trying to convince consumers to use them. But first, you actually had to convince the car manufacturers to even adopt the idea. And I haven't read the detailed history of the seatbelt, but I've read enough around it to know that there was a lot of resistance at first from car manufacturers around seatbelts, and they thought it was a waste of time. And so that's how I would take that analogy, that we need to think more about, again, regulation, really. Like what guardrails are we going to put around this system and force companies to go ahead and abide by, rather than thinking about it only from the consumer end? Because again, I'll just reiterate what I said earlier, like there's just only so much you can do as a consumer with a lot of these practices, short of trying to completely wall yourself off from modern tech.
So I'm loving the sharing of resources in the chat, and we'll save this chat, by the way, and we'll post these resources after the session. But given what we're talking about now, Kevin, I want to ask you a question. We've got about 5 minutes left. You are an avowed internet optimist. Why? And is there a paradigm shift in regard to data ownership and control that makes you think that we are on an upswing?
Yeah, I am, for a couple of reasons, right? So I'm old enough to remember when people were terrified of the idea of doing banking on the internet. You're crazy if you want to do banking on the internet. So, and then a simple protocol came out called SSL that allowed that to then become normal. Everybody's like, sure, of course, I buy stuff from Amazon and do banking all the time now. Don't even think about it. Don't even notice the little padlock in the browser anymore. But that had to be invented. I mean, somebody had to invent that protocol in order to allow commerce on the internet to occur. So I believe a similar thing is going to apply here, where something really that keeping it really simple is the key to making it, you know, and again, as a protocol kind of expression, is the key to making it actually work. And that's kind of at least our approach to it. But the yeah, I think it's inevitable. I don't think I'm even optimistic, but I do believe, Dr. King, the only thing I would maybe disagree slightly, and I agree with the points. I think regulation, and especially in the enforcement's super key. And you know, love class actions, and but I think putting the power. I mean, so Google didn't always exist. There were search engines before Google. There were search engines after Google, and so things can be disrupted. I mean, there can be huge changes that are driven by people and their behavior. So if there's a better option to Facebook out there that provides better results and is private, I'm again, as an optimist, I believe that will take over and Facebook will become. You remember when people used to do, you know, MySpace and you know that kind of stuff, and these things change. So I actually do believe in the power of people to do it just by voting with their time and their dollars. And so, but that's not to diminish the importance of, as you said, guardrails and especially with regard to federal government and putting the teeth of enforcement behind the regulations. That's super important. But I think as far as enterprises go, what we have to do is give them a better business model that, we think we know what that is, but a better business model is what's going to be required in order to really make this shift happen, for them to move. Otherwise, they're just going to fight it as long as they can. I think I took 5 minutes. I hope I didn't.
No. I just had to ask. There's a really interesting comment. Thank you, Will, for sharing it. And it's a long one, so I won't read the whole thing, but it's a quote from Peter Senge and Charlie Kiefer about compliance. I like this quote: 90% of the time, what passes for commitment is compliance. Selling generally means getting someone to do something that he or she might not do if they were in full possession of the facts. There's a lot of interesting thinking here. I think you're backing in a little bit to this whole issue of business model. If we can think of a better business model, then we can also start solving these problems. And I also think it's interesting what you say, Dr. King, about at the enterprise level, we can impact consumer behavior. But the consumer will sometimes be led by the enterprise. Not in all cases, but yes, I think for some of these, if they're compliant, then our data will learn compliance. But I do appreciate the grassroots efforts that we're making. And I think we need to continue along those lines. We are at the top of the hour, so I do want to be respectful of time. And I want to thank our panelists, Enoch, Dr. King, Kevin. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you, everyone, for joining the call. And we will be sharing this out afterwards to everyone who has registered with the full video link, so you have the reference and all of these great resources that were shared in the chat. Thank you again.
Thank you, Dr. King. Thank you, company.
Thank you all very much.
Pleasure.